We did a good job. We did it right. I'd do it 1,000 times over.
The president says you're dead wrong about election security, and to him you say what?
There is no foreign power that is flipping votes. There's no domestic actor flipping votes. I did it right. We did it right. This was a secure election.
So that's Chris Krebs. He's the former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. He gave that interview to 60 Minutes in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election. The administration in which he served was Republican, was Donald Trump's administration. He was a lifelong Republican, but he had a national security job, much in the same way that, Miles, you did. He was debunking all of Trump's election lies about foreign interference. But importantly, the DNI, as Laura, you said, was John Ratcliffe. But until May of that year, the person in charge of protecting all the intelligence agencies was Rick Grenell. So Trump was up to his eyeballs, not just in Republicans, but in MAGA Republicans. Laura, is there any reporting that he's going to bring back any of the Democrats who ran those agencies when President Obama was president or President Biden was president and the elections were secure? Because, again, he's run 3 times. The 2 times he won, Democrats were president, and they ran all these agencies in charge of cybersecurity and national intelligence.
No, there's no indication that he's going to bring back any of those Democrats.
Why not? Those are the only elections he trusts.
That's true if you go based on what he says and when he's actually won. But to the point that you were making before the break, I just want to address it because we've seen the president's playbook before when it comes to when all of a sudden, Republicans win elections, when he wins, and whether or not he would backtrack off of these claims and these falsehoods that he's likely about to spread as soon as this Thursday. Because my colleague Jake Traylor also added to our reporting saying that the president's speech this coming Thursday is going to be about this, about his allegations of foreign election interference in 2020. And if it turns out that Republicans do well in the midterms, better than expected, if they keep control of the House, then we have the president's playbook there. Because in the past, when he won in 2024, he said, well, we made it too big to rig. So he rationalizes and he comes up with explanations for why when he floods the zone with this disinformation, if he ends up winning, he just excuses it. But I think that when I talk to election administrators, including one I was just talking to today about this coming out, them trying to release these documents, what really stuck with me was that this election administrator said that they really feel like the confusion is the point here, that the chaos is the point, because already they have a lot of voters that are coming up to them, asking them about the rules in this upcoming election and if they're going to have to provide their passports. And so much of the job of election administrators right now and officials is to simply tell voters, look, the rules for our state, including in swing states, hasn't changed. And so they're just trying to keep up with that level of disinformation right now and tell voters that it is safe and secure and they can turn out and vote.
Director Brennan, if people can't trust the outcome now, when Trump, with all the lies he's spread, is the president of the United States, when Trump's appointees have a supermajority on the Supreme Court, when Trump's MAGA Republicans have a majority in the Senate, when Trump's sycophants have a majority in the House, they never will. I mean, what are we doing here?
That's very, very worrisome, Nicole, because as you point out, the executive branch and the president has tremendous authority to exert the full weight and influence of the executive branch. And he's clearly trying to do that, not just in terms of manipulation of the perceptions of reality, but also using the instruments of governance. And so the next 4 months, I can clearly see that Donald Trump is going to do everything in his power and beyond that to be able to affect the outcome of the election. And so there is really a question about, in light of what he is doing and how he is putting both thumbs and the rest of his fingers on the scale, whether or not that outcome can be trusted. You asked before, what happens if the Republicans win? Well, I think there's going to be quite a serious doubt that they won fairly. just because of what he has done. And it's a similar, what's happening with the Department of Justice. All the corruption and all the action that is going election. I expect Donald Trump to use, again, whatever tactic, ploy, or underhanded maneuver he can. And unfortunately, there are too many individuals who surround him in the White House and too many individuals in Congress. And then, as you point out, even in the Supreme Court, who are willing to turn a blind eye to the obvious and brazen corruption and actions that he is taking.
Miles, I guess we're in a post-fact, post-truth era. We're also in sort of a post-humility era. But culturally, people hate bad losers. People hate cheaters. And he's projecting both to the country in his own base. What does this moment say about culture and about sort of the collapse of both any sense of humor and any morality inside his accomplices in the media, in the sort of Larry Ellison conglomerate, in the manosphere? All these tropes about, masculinity are gone when you've got someone cheating out loud in full view of their own base of support and really trying to sell this story that only Obama and Biden run free and fair elections.
Well, you know what? Let me validate that story, Nicole, because I'll tell you something. You've got two generations of election protection here on the screen. It's, John Brennan, Director Brennan from the Obama administration, and then I was working on election protection in the Trump administration. I have never seen anyone do more sophisticated and impressive work on election protection than the director and his team. And I didn't even witness it in person. I have disagreed with John Brennan on issues on which reasonable people can disagree on policy issues. And I have got to say, when we took over in the Trump administration, we were given a gift by this man and his team, an incredibly detailed, thorough analysis of interference in our democracy. He's a patriot of the highest order for doing that. And we then continued to try to protect our elections, not because of Donald Trump, but despite Donald Trump. Let me give you a revelation here on air. In 2018, we knew that these countries that Director Brennan had told us were interfering in our democracy in 2016 were still interfering in our 2018 midterms. But you know what Donald Trump wanted to do? He didn't want to talk about Russian interference because it was helpful to him. He only wanted to talk about Chinese interference. He went in front of the UN General Assembly and said China was interfering in our elections. And our agents and analysts were gobsmacked because we also knew so were the Russians. That's the type of president we had. He only wanted to protect against interference that would hurt him and not protect against interference that would help him. So the things you heard Chris Krebs say, and his head of the DNI and his FBI chief and his CIA director, they did the good work to protect our elections in 2020, not because of Trump, but despite Donald Trump.
So, Miles, if he went out in 2018 and told a lie or cherry-picked, which is, I think, what Laura's describing is planned for Thursday night, how should Thursday night be covered?
It should be covered as twice warmed over, as leftovers. I hope not just every journalist. I hope every American flashes back to that episode I just mentioned in September of 2018 when Donald Trump went out there and he was ranting about Chinese interference. We had no indication that Chinese interference in our elections influenced votes. Did the Chinese try to interfere? Yeah, they did. We declassified it. That information is out there. They tried to meddle. The Iranians tried to meddle. The Russians tried to meddle. But importantly, we don't believe they changed votes or influenced our elections. He's going to go back to the well on those claims from 2018 and just focus on one threat actor that was opposed to him to try to make this case again. But you know what I hope people see is this is a loser. This is an old man and a loser who cannot handle the fact that he lost an election fair and square. I think that's what's going to come through on Thursday rather than any breathtaking new information, because I'm going to tell you, it is not there.
Why then, Miles, would he have not declassified that intelligence if he'd done it in 2018 and he was still the president from November to January 20th at the time?
Well, I don't know. I wish I knew what he took with him down into the basement of Mar-a-Lago. And we would only know if they would let the results of that investigation be released. But you know what gives me heart, Nicole? We are eventually going to find out. We are eventually going to find out what this man took, the lies he's cooking up behind the scenes, because they cannot sweep it all under the rug. They're going to try. They've tried to say the Presidential Records Act doesn't apply to them. But you know what? You can't erase the people who've witnessed it now, the people who witnessed it then. We will eventually know. And in the meantime, we just need to keep heart. We need to keep attention to the foundations of our democracy. We need to push back against the lies publicly.